Now that you've almost got a fairy godmother.
Exactly, yes. An older one.
This is West of Drumlochy Farm near Blairgowrie, home to Johnny Mackey, Technical Projects Manager for Quality Meat Scotland, and his wife Susie, a local vet. Today they're blood sampling some of the small herd of beef shorthorns as part of a health scheme. While farmers can take dung samples, blood sampling can only be done by a vet. Blood sampling can alert cattle farmers to health problems before the symptoms are displayed. This obviously enables farmers to act early to control the problem, so saving in the long run time, money and possibly lives. So, when you're routinely blood testing for brucellosis, consider asking your vet to take additional blood samples at the same time for analysis.
We can screen the animals or indeed the herd for several very important diseases such as BVD, leptospirosis, IBR and Jones. And we can also use it to screen clinical cases, an individual sick animal that we're trying to find out what the problem is.
With blood sampling, a vet has to do that, but farmers can take dung samples, and what's the value of doing that?
Yes, they can take dung samples for fluke, worm eggs, and also for a Jones examination. It can be done by dung as well. If they're just wanting to monitor kind of parasites in the dung, such as fluke and worms, then a pooled sample is sufficient if they take fresh samples from several animals all into one container. But if it's an individual animal, we're looking at a clinical case where we suspect something like Jones, and also indeed for Jones every time you need an individual animal sample so that you can identify the individual animal.
How worthwhile is it for farmers to adopt a regular monitoring system, not specifically looking for one disease?
I think it's quite important. I think it's very helpful to monitor your health status so that then you know where you are and you can then decide where you want to be, and indeed to try and get incoming animals up to a similar standard.
One of the current cattle diseases of most concern to farmers is Jones, but few fully understand the disease and why it is so important, yet so difficult to keep out of herds. One vet with some of the answers is the SAC's George Caldo.
Jones disease is a bacterial disease, and it's caused by a bacterium which is closely related to the bacterium which causes tuberculosis in cattle. It's quite a resistant bacterium, tough organism, but it causes a slowly progressive disease. So most animals are infected when they're young calves, but they only develop the disease when they're 3 to 5 years of age, and sometimes even older than that. Now, what the disease is it's a progressive infection of the intestines, and it causes a failure in digestion and a failure in absorption. So the results of that are twofold. One, they lose body condition, and two, they scour. In the period before they start to develop very obvious signs, their energy balance will be affected. So if it's a cow, they'll quite often be infertile. So some of the animals that have Jones disease will be going out of the herd, not because the farmer thinks they've got Jones disease, but because they haven't held to the bull. They're also more susceptible to other conditions, mastitis, lameness, various other conditions like that as well.
Does that fertility situation apply to the bull as well?
Well, I think if you don't have a bull in the target body condition score, he's not going to stand the rigours of the mating season. So yes, if he's under condition, he's not going to do the job.
So how do cattle actually pick Jones up? How are they infected?
It's spread from feces from animals that are infected to young stock, to particularly the younger calves. It can be spread in colostrum. It can be spread in utero, so that the heavily infected cow, their calves are very likely to be infected. There is theoretical risks with breeding technology as well. Once the infection comes into the herd, so a carrier animal comes into the herd and starts to enter the later stages of the disease when they're producing thinner feces, and it coincides with the period at the start of calving, then you're going to get fecal contamination from that cow onto the teats, udders of other cows, and you're going to get new infections in calves, not merely the calf of the affected cow. So cornerstone to all our control programs is doing everything that's possible to improve the hygiene of cows in the period round about calving. Many situations, what would be best for the herd would be to be outside at a nicer time of year than March or April.
Sheep and rabbits are both carriers of Johne's. How much of a risk are they to cattle?
Yeah, well, SAC's done quite a bit of work on the rabbit situation, and what we've found is that rabbits do become infected in areas where there are infected cattle, and the infection persists in the rabbits. And interestingly, rabbit faeces is not something that cattle avoid when they're grazing. So we have a situation where the rabbit faeces have a high number of Johne's disease organisms in it, and the cattle don't do anything to avoid them. And therefore there is a theoretical risk that rabbit populations will be instrumental in maintaining infections in herds and could possibly spread it into herds that haven't had it before if a neighbouring herd has Johne's disease. So again, rabbit control is part of our advice on both prevention of Johne's disease and control of Johne's disease. The situation for sheep is slightly more complex than that. Sheep have their own sort of Johne's disease that we tend to see in hill breeds, and cattle aren't affected by that. But sheep will also be infected by the cattle strains. So if you have sheep grazing with infected cattle, they will pick up the disease, and some of the wastage in your sheep flock will undoubtedly be the result of Johne's disease. But the indications are that they don't maintain the infection to the extent that cattle will then become reinfected from a sheep source. So they are more innocent bystanders, spillover hosts than the rabbits probably are in this disease. I think that the key way to control Johne's disease, BVD, and any other major health risk to the suckler herd is to sit down with your vet and consider what the diseases are, what the risks that your system pose to bringing those diseases in or maintaining those diseases, and that is the basis of your health plan.